Welcome to the third annual Cooperative Issues Forum, and we're pleased. The first year we did a broad-based look at the cooperative community. Last year we focused on the International Year of the Cooperative, and this year we're looking at co-ops as the catalyst in the community, which actually has a link to the International Year as well. And I want to direct your attention to the blueprint for the co-op decade, which has been mentioned already. There are copies on the table back there. This is the International Cooperative Alliance's blueprint that is to be a priority for the next 7 years, gets us to 2020. And there are 5 major themes in the blueprint, which are what is hoped to be the cooperative community's goal to really accomplish things in those areas over the next, we call it a decade, but we'll take whatever years we've got for it. And what we've done with this program today is we've taken the first of those 5 themes, which is participation. And we decided that rather than try to just scratch the surface of all 5, we would focus on that one because it is one that's so rich right now with the kinds of things that are going on around the U.S. and the world, but our focus being on the U.S. And this is about co-op principles 6 and 7. It's about co-ops helping co-ops, and it's also about the co-ops and community. And we like to say that collaboration and cooperation is in the co-op DNA. And I think today you're going to hear some of the very interesting things that are going on around the country. Some of them are cooperatives banding together to look at opportunities and do problem solving in their areas. In the other case that we'll hear today, it's about communities beginning to solve problems and coming to the solution that a cooperative is part of their answer. So it's both the co-op community and what it's doing, but it's also that collaboration where communities are really seeing that there is this opportunity. So we have a little bit of each in our panel today, and I think without any further ado, I want to get to them. And what we've asked each panel member to do is to really describe the collaboration that they're involved in. And then in describing it, to also identify kind of what were some of the catalysts. What was it that really got this collaboration going? Was it a particular need? Was it the energy of particular people? And then what challenges they've faced along the way and what they've learned in terms of lessons about best practices that they could suggest to other groups that wanted to do something similar. And I think there'll be some real interesting conversation around that. We then have Gar ALPEROVITZ to be a reactor to what he hears from these examples, but then to also offer his bigger picture perspective as being really a student of the American culture and the culture of community, and also having just finished a book tour on the West Coast and to give us some sense of what kind of interaction he had there with his new book, the long title. What
must we do?
What then must we do? Which will be on sale down in the reception later today. But I'm going to start with Philadelphia. All things start with Philadelphia. And it's only appropriate since in our Hall of Fame we have Benjamin Franklin, who was also the creator of really the first mutual insurance cooperative in Philadelphia, the collaborative or contributorship, which is still functioning today. And it really was the roots of, I think, what Philadelphia started with in terms of its earliest grounding in co-ops. There have been later worker co-op movements that have developed over the years, and even an era where you had the O&O grocery stores owned and operated worker co-op grocery stores. And then most recently, the Philadelphia Alliance that you have been a co-founder of and you're really, along with a lot of the other Philadelphia area cooperatives. Bob, why don't you tell us a bit about what brought it about you started in 2012 with PACA.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Mike and Gap. Before I start, I want to mention that, there's one other person here who deserves recognition that I've worked with in Philadelphia, and that's Peter Frank. So Peter, would you just wave around to people? Peter's worked closely with me in Philadelphia and deserves a lot of recognition for that. So it's wonderful that Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance is being recognized. We're really grateful to have this attention. We started working in Philadelphia together, I guess maybe in 2009, 2010, but we didn't really start formally meeting as a cross-sector network until January of 2011. So I'll describe our process a little bit and what we've done, and then I'll talk a little bit in particular about our relationship and collaboration with the university, which I see that we're a little bit being recognized for the work that we've done with that at Drexel University and with the public policy work that we've been doing. And then I'll just try to give you one or two observations or reflections on our work. So as I said, we started in 2011, and really the first year we met regularly. We had participation primarily from food co-ops, where it's probably not surprising that they really have this cooperative spirit. We have other consumer co-ops. There's an energy co-op in Philadelphia, a third-party energy provider, and they have about 7,000 consumer members, or maybe 8,000 by now. We've had good support from credit unions. We have one credit union representative on our steering committee now. And intermittent support from the housing co-ops. But I should have mentioned first before that, we've had support from the worker co-op community too. We've had our meetings in their offices. So we have some work to do to balance it out and get better cross-sector representation, but I feel good about where we are right now. The first year was mostly planning. We decided our purpose. We talked about our mission, what's our vision for Philadelphia. Took a while to come up with that. Basically, it's to help Philadelphia citizens by growing the cooperative economy, and that's it in a nutshell. Then we've decided what we wanted to do together, what kind of project could we work on that would further our mission, and we thought we'd start with some sort of summit or gathering that would sort of break the ice, since at least in none of our memory we had come together before. This is something new for us from different sectors. So we thought, could it be a social event? What could it be? And we were fortunate to have somebody meeting with us who supported us from the local Philadelphia Department of Commerce. And he remembered a conference that Drexel University had on business improvement districts from several years prior to that. And it was very successful. It was an academic style conference. They did research, they did case studies, they did presentations, and the entire effort was published in the Drexel Law Review. So we thought maybe Drexel might be willing to do a similar type of conference for co-ops. So lots of negotiations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but we went through that process, and it wasn't until, I guess, the end of that year that we were ready to begin publicizing the conference, and we decided it would be June of last year when we held it. And that forced us to pick a name. We didn't have a name. That's when we picked the PACA as our name, and we got our website up. And also at that time, Philadelphia City Council, we had previously, actually before PACA even formed, we had, in 2010, we had this delegation. This is sort of a pre-PACA activity where we went and asked our congressman, my congressman, Chaka Fattah, if he would be willing to be our champion in Congress and do that, and he said yes. And many of you know about the National Cooperative Development Act that was introduced at the end of 2011. But one of his senior staff people became our our city council representative. And we decided to go to talk to her right around during this planning period prior to the conference with Drexel, and ask her to introduce a resolution into City Council, which immediately she said yes, recognizing the contributions of everybody from Ben Franklin through the various cooperative history in Philadelphia, as well as the International Year of Co-ops. So that was a big achievement. It was the first day of City Council in January, and we got that resolution passed, so that was nice. And then we had a number of activities leading up, again, kind of publicizing and getting our work out there. We had a celebration, a social thing, a co-op happy hour, and eventually we had the conference in June, which was great. It was like 200 or 300 people, and there was case studies, presentation. It ended up being, for a peculiar reason, we had folks from Madison, Wisconsin come. So it was sort of a comparison of co-ops from Philadelphia to similar co-ops that were in Madison. Food, worker type of presentations. And so that added a certain slant and interest to the conference. And we were really excited to have done that, and I think we got a lot of recognition in the city, and we were able to leverage that towards some public policy work to follow up on that, the work that we had previously done. We did some research on how local governments have supported co-op development in other cities around the country, and we published that. That's available on our website to sort of inform us on what types of public policy advocacy work we might be doing in Philadelphia. And then last November, we had a co-op summit, invited people together. How can we go to the next step? How can we more formalize our organization and move the Philadelphia cooperative economy to the next step? We decided we needed to be a membership organization where we would have co-ops and credit unions as members. We would have a board. We would have paid staff. We knew we had to do that to be effective. So we needed bylaws and incorporation, and so we've been doing all that, sort of focusing on our own internal development. Our bylaws will be ready maybe in a month or two. We'll have our due structure, and we will be able to recruit our first official members. So we will have a steering committee that will convert itself to a board at that time, and we'll be able to reinvigorate the different projects. So what are some of the projects? We're collaborating with Haverford College on a cooperative economic impact study in the region, and we hope to leverage that towards, again, more public support for cooperative development. We had visioning that we were doing. We want to focus on 4 areas: cooperative development, education and research, public policy, and support, as we call it, for existing co-ops. So we're working on a cooperative loan fund, and we have committees along with communications committee, education committee, finance committee, the economic impact, bylaws, etc. We have a tremendous amount of young people. So this is actually one of our challenges for me personally, is to be able to just let go and let them do it, because they do it so well, and we've really been fortunate. I think it speaks to how we are really a movement that it's captured the imagination of so many people. They want to become involved in co-ops in one way or another, and it's great to be able to have a public center or group like PACA that would allow people to come in and be involved in that. So there's, we have to be able to give them the projects and the committees, as well as actually providing technical assistance and financing and business plan development, so forth, to the actual co-ops that are starting to form in Philadelphia. We have 2 or 3 food co-ops right into the city, and other ones that are startup efforts in the suburbs and the surrounding area. We have a taxi worker co-op that's under development now that probably will have taxis on the street by the fall. That's our ambition. So there's a number of efforts that are happening, as well as the projects, and this has been exciting. So that's pretty much the PACA in a nutshell. I'll talk a little bit more about Drexel and what we've done with universities, because we've looked at our organization as kind of building the infrastructure, and we first have to organize. My background's sort of in community organizing and workplace organizing and a little bit of political campaign organizing. So I look at it like you organize your base and then you look for strategic allies. And so that's what I think, that's the approach I've taken. We have to make sure that we're working together, the co-ops themselves, that we can bring ourselves together, we have some level of cohesion, and it's not necessarily sequential, we're 100% organized and then we go and look outwards to allies. It's kind of back and forth a little bit. But I think academics is a good example of a strategic ally, the academic community. If you really think about it, and this is an exercise I'd like to do with the rest of the steering committee and PACA, is to kind of list who are the potential strategic allies that we could collaborate with on projects. We have, I think trade unions are one where there's a common level of interest, a faith-based community. You could really make quite a long list of people, the community and economic development folks who do it privately and publicly. These are all potential strategic allies. So I think our work with Drexel has kind of fallen into that category of seeing them as an important potential strategic ally. We can help them, they can help us. So what did we do after the conference? We thought about it, and basically we came up with the idea of having perhaps a center for study in Philadelphia, Center for Cooperative Studies or Research. And the person at the Center for Public Policy at Drexel, who was the person who sponsored our conference, thought that would be a great idea. So we're working on that. Our first step will be a certificate program for co-ops, that we would be able to have some sort of education for co-op staff, credit union staff. It's one of the, how am I doing on time here?
You're getting close.
Getting close, okay. The public policy, as I said, we were we've been working on that. We have a number of initiatives. We were preceded in our work in Philadelphia by a group called PACE. Back in 1985, there was an ordinance passed in City Council which allocated $500,000 for a cooperative development fund. Unfortunately, it was just a piece of paper that they passed, but it was never implemented. But we're actually using that old bill, towards, as a talking point, as leverage to put some, revitalize it, revise it, and put it into action now. So I guess I'll finish up by just saying that building the infrastructure is important, and that's what we're doing. And the notion of a cooperative movement that's actually something that people can really get involved in and see. And I think that the International Year helped us, and I think other groups we feed off of. There's actually a national kind of association of regional, local cross-sector groups around the country, like ERBIN's group in Austin, Texas that Mike Bell mentioned, and a dozen other cities. So we're all talking to each other of how to do cross-sector organizing in the city, and it really is a movement. So, thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. The Neighboring Food Co-op Association is only several years old. ERBIN CROWELL, who leads it, has been around the cooperative community much longer than that, and probably organizing similar kind of initiatives elsewhere. But what I think is real telling is on their website, they're under where it says Neighboring Food Co-op Association, it says for a thriving regional economy. So its whole grounding is on how to do something regionally and cross-sector, I think, as well. So it's truly in your DNA with that organization. I think they've got a number of interesting initiatives that are underway. One in particular that I asked him to focus on, but he can talk about all of them, is the work they're doing with the Cooperative Fund of New England around the Healthy Food Initiative. And just some real interesting things. ERBIN, why don't you give us a snapshot?
Great. Thank you, Liz. It's great to see you all. I feel like I'm in a room of friends and colleagues in this work. So yeah, I was going to touch on a few of the things that we've been working on in the NFCA, but first I want to talk a little bit about myself. Just kidding. Because, actually I will for a second, because I think it's important, you know, it's always valuable to me, especially the folks in this room, understanding where people come from. And I learned about the cooperative movement, I would argue, quite by accident, you know, as an undergraduate. And it was a crucial thing for me at that time, because I was very desperate for something that could make a difference in the world, that could help me have impact. And I wish I could say it was my university, but it wasn't. I wish I could say it was the co-op movement that reached out to me, but it was really nowhere to be seen. It was the fluke of a liberal university that allowed students to organize their own classes. And I got a group of students together and we talked about socially responsible business. And it was in that context that I first learned about equal exchange. And by another fluke, ended up spending about a decade with that worker co-op and fair trade organization. And you know, over that time, what really became compelling to me wasn't just equal exchange, it was the system that it was part of. You know, purchasing from farmer co-ops, selling to food co-ops, working with credit cooperatives in that process. And I just became very passionate about what is it that makes systems like that work, and ended up in the St. Mary's program, the Master of Management in Co-ops and Credit Unions, which I mention because core to that program is understanding what makes co-ops successful as businesses and social entities, but also what makes complexes work. And what we came back to, you know, whether you're looking at Mondragon or Northern Italy or Quebec, you see regional associations, both within sectors and across sectors, that are advocating for their members, influencing policy, creating educational opportunities. And so coming out of that experience, I've had the chance to work with two organizations like that. The first is the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops in Western Mass, which was the subject of my final paper for St. Mary's, basically sharing with them the lessons that I'd learned and trying to lay out a blueprint for how we could put those lessons into action. And then the other was the Neighboring Food Co-op Association, which really had sort of organized at around the same time. People started talking in about 2005 just about the simple act of getting together and sharing information and increasing their impact. There was a t-shirt produced at that time that said, "No longer blank in isolation." You know, and you could, whether it was planning or marketing or visioning, this group no longer wanted to do that as one-offs. And that's the group I now serve as executive director for, and we incorporated about 2 years ago as a second-level cooperative. And I would argue that that's probably one of the things I would want to share. I think it's crucial to our success that we are, in fact, a cooperative, and my work is accountable to my members and mostly funded by my members. And that shapes our work in working toward this thriving regional economy. The second half of that vision is an economy rooted in a healthy, just, and sustainable food system and a vibrant community of cooperative enterprise. So if you take those things together, our group created a very holistic vision and approach to development. What's interesting in terms of catalyzing development on the community level is often our food co-ops aren't on the radar. People see them as isolated entities and don't really recognize their impact as systems. And Liz mentioned healthy food access. You know, food security is a very important issue in our communities, and yet food co-ops would almost never show up on the radar of food system activists or NGOs or organizations working on this question. And we found that that was all about perception. I mean, honestly, when we first started working with Co-op Fund of New England to try to find some grant resources to research this question, the immediate response we almost always got was, look, it's self-evident that food co-ops are too expensive. We don't even need to look at this question. So first there was this perception we had to confront. And our first project there was sort of evaluating what each of our co-ops are doing around affordability, how we could share these models. And the impact we've had in that has been dramatic in terms of getting food co-ops to the table. The other thing that was, I think, crucial to our development was simply measuring our impact. You know, before these co-ops got together, no one was really thinking about how we affect the food system as a whole. And that's a process we've been updating annually now. And so our association is 30 food co-ops and startups. About a third of our members are startup cooperatives, which gives you a sense of the momentum of food co-ops in our region. We've got 80,000 shared members, 200 million in revenue. We're purchasing 30 million in local products. And you know, no one had really considered these numbers. And they became very compelling, not just to our own members, but also to policymakers. Taken together, our Vermont members would be among the top 25 employers in Vermont. You know, no one would have thought of that before we did this study. And the Vermont Secretary of Agriculture probably never would have asked to come to our annual meeting this past spring if we hadn't been promoting those numbers and he had recognized the impact that we were having. So what we've been trying to do is how do you take all that shared both wealth and impact and turn it into the change you want to see in your community. And another key thing our co-ops wanted to do was use some of our buying power to affect regional sources of food. We had actually put together this whole list of products our co-ops wanted to buy locally, but they couldn't access. And obviously the question there is, if we've got $30 million in local buying power, surely we can affect the system around us. And in that first year, after we were incorporated, we launched a project of locally sourced produce that we were freezing, processing locally, and distributing to our member co-ops. Now that doesn't sound that earth-shattering unless you had been in those co-ops before and picked up all those bags of produce and turned them over to see where they were from. Best case scenario is California. Worst case scenario, and the more likely scenario is China. You know, so in terms of changing the food system very quickly, we were able to demonstrate that impact right off the bat. I would say another area we've been trying to think strategically is cross-sector collaboration. And in those frozen products, a key partner of ours was a produce co-op called Deep Root Organic Co-op. Which, you know, interestingly, you know, food hubs, again, are a very big topic. People are trying to figure out how to aggregate locally, distribute locally, and here's a produce cooperative that's been around for 25 years and is on no one's radar, right? I mean, if you want a sustainable model, there it is. And so we deliberately collaborated with them in this project and have also tried to extend that collaboration to other opportunities. We worked with the New England Farmers Union and with the support of CoBank secured a grant from the USDA to research what it would look like to create a distribution co-op between their producer co-op and our food co-ops. Because right now the primary obstacle is distribution. In 2012, we tried to take those lessons out into the community in a lot of our presentations and share not just the food co-op model, but the co-op model in general. And I think in a lot of our areas, people feel like they know their food co-op. But when you start adding our impact to the farmer co-ops in our region, to the credit unions, to the housing co-ops, to the worker co-ops, that's when I saw audiences, you know, in our presentations sit up and take notice and start to recognize the impact and potential that we could start having around us. Organic Valley was a key partner in that, Equal Exchange, UMass 5 College Credit Union. So really we're just trying to take the simple pieces that are sitting all around us and start to work together in collaboration to have impact in our communities. One area we tried to build on that is something called the Valley Cooperative Business Association, which was deliberately named to echo the NCBA's name. And this is a cross-sector second-level co-op that we incorporated last year, along with Franklin Community Co-op, UMass 5 College Credit Union, and again, the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops to advocate locally around policy, co-op development, but also just give a place for co-ops to get together and try to do more co-op to co-op business. And that's been a very exciting process for us. And again, you know, we established it deliberately as a co-op, so our co-ops would feel that it was accountable to them. The last example I want to bring, and it sort of brings it around full circle, is this week I'm receiving the final papers from my class on the Cooperative Commonwealth at the University of Massachusetts, which is part of a certificate in cooperative enterprise, which is, again, the direct result of the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops organizing and the NFCA's support going to the economics department saying, look, we've noticed you all have been talking about things like Mondragon lately, about co-ops in other countries. Did you notice that we're all around you? Interestingly enough, UMass, as far as I know, has the only system of student-run businesses in the country. So there's a network of about 10. There's a food co-op, a bike shop, sub shop, cafeteria, that are all run collectively by students, many of them since the 70s. So operating by consensus, a bunch of students coming and going, operating businesses. And I'd probably say not by coincidence, but as total surprise, the campus center of UMass is named after Murray Lincoln. For people who may or may not know Murray Lincoln, founded Nationwide, led the NCBA for a while, served on the ICA board. This is a UMass graduate. The central building on campus is named after this cooperator, and yet we're still struggling to get co-ops into the curriculum in this institution. So I guess what I'd wrap up on, and I really want to hear people's questions, is just, is the blueprint. In all the time I've been working on co-ops, I have not seen the ICA say anything so exciting and ambitious. And you know, some people just say off the map, so we're going to be the fastest growing business model in the world. Yeah, right. I'm extremely excited that they had the audacity to say something like that. And we actually considered that plan at our annual meeting. And it was very exciting to see our food co-ops sort of come out of their own day-to-day business and see the movement around them and think about what we could be doing together. So I think the question moving forward is going to be the degree to which we take up the banner of that blueprint and try to make the most of it through collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. ERBIN mentions in the blueprint that challenge that we've focused on the co-ops and their external relationships in this forum on the first of the themes, which is the one of participation. But one of their large areas of focus in that first theme is how do you get your own membership more engaged, the kinds of things that you are doing. And how do you really broaden that so that being a member of a co-op isn't just a transaction, but that it really is a very much of a participatory kind of thing that at a new level. So that's you're on the way. I should mention too, one of the outgrowths of the International Year of the Co-op was there was a focus on really having grassroots kinds of activities going on all over the country. And while these are all things that were started much before then, there were a number of places in Seattle, in the Rogue Co-ops out in Oregon, the New York City cooperative community, I think, came together around the UN resolution too. There are a lot of these community level activities that were just part of that entire IYC organizational effort, and I think the residual will be there for a number of years to come. And I think these are the kinds of organizations that give them role models to be able to grow and expand into too. We're going to shift now from where this is co-ops collaborating with each other to more of an example of where a community or a government or a problem solving in that public sector has turned to co-ops as a solution and where it's become a partnership. Bob mentioned that the Madison, Wisconsin was involved in your work. The mayor of Madison, Wisconsin held a conference last year about cooperative economy in that community. I think the Oakland, California has a mayor too who has been a real advocate and understands the role that co-ops can play. In Philadelphia, obviously, you've got Fatah in that group. But I think there are other examples too where there have been, where co-op becomes a solution for public policymakers, where they maybe didn't start out thinking about a co-op, but they actually have created one. And I think one example we're going to focus on here is the multi-stakeholder co-op, which is a relatively new for our country. There are a lot of them in Canada, but the US, it's emerging as more of an interesting co-op model that really is, I think, particularly interesting when you're getting community involvement at a different level. And in profiling this, we found the center of the multi-stakeholder co-op universe, and it's Vernon County, Wisconsin. And it is, and there are actually two examples we're going to focus on here for it, but there are several reasons, I think, why it can happen in a place like Vernon County. And what happened was Fifth Season Cooperative, which was developed several years ago, but it couldn't have happened, I don't believe, without the fact that there was a strong cross-sector cooperative community there. There were agriculture, rural electric, credit unions, food co-ops. There was Organic Valley, headquartered right there in the area as a real anchor, not just a local co-op, but a corporate cooperative organization. And then what you added to that, the other ingredients were you had an economic development director at the county level who believed in problem solving in the most comprehensive way. You had the resources of U.S. Department of Agriculture. The Wisconsin office with its cooperative programming is by far the best in the country, and they were involved every step of the way. And then you had leadership from groups like Organic Valley and others who were part of the catalysts, and you had local institutions, in this case universities and hospitals, who really wanted access to healthy foods and locally produced foods. And all of that came together to create something called the Fifth Season Cooperative. And Jerry is here representing one of the founding organizations, Crop known there, but Organic Valley marketed nationwide that we all know. And Jerry, why don't you tell us about Fifth Season and how it happened?
Sure, thanks Liz, and glad to be here and talk a little bit about this pretty interesting model, I think. You know, Liz mentioned Vernon County, Wisconsin, which is where I call home. I live in a town called Viroqua, which is the county seat, and it's a bustling metropolis of about 4,500 people. The county in total, I think, has a population of around 30,000. So it's very rural, very rural. It also is, as Liz pointed out, the home to Organic Valley. And, you know, Organic Valley has been there for quite some time. We're just celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. I just had our annual meeting a couple weeks ago, and it was kind of this love fest on the 25 years, which was good. But you know, I think I'm bringing it up because it talks a little bit about the community I come from, and you're going to hear a couple of parallels to some of the things that ERBIN brought up. But this very rural, very lowly populated area also is home to over 200 organic farms, certified organic farms, many of which belong to Organic Valley, but many of which do not, and are very independent. You know, ERBIN brought up some of these terms like food security and food hubs and things of that nature, perhaps because of that organic presence. I think our community is very interested in food politics and issues around food security and what a local food system might look like. So much so that a local NGO called the Valley Stewardship Network a few years back decided to take a closer look at that. What was our local food economy, and were there opportunities within that economy? And that's the first place I think that Organic Valley came in. We helped fund the research that they did. And so this group, Valley Stewardship Network, spent some time looking at the overall food economy, and really they came out of it and they recognized that a lot of these producers, organic or not, that were small or mid-size, were having to take their product to market relatively far away. Minneapolis, Chicago, Madison, Milwaukee, places like that, which for you know, an individual small producer is a infrastructure challenge for them. Meanwhile, a lot of what they were producing was not being consumed right there where they called home. So was there an opportunity there? And that's kind of what, you know, the Valley Stewardship Network started to identify, and that there were really some challenges for some of these producers, and mainly aggregation. How could they aggregate their product in a manner that then would make it, you know, easy to distribute in a very local fashion? Meanwhile, a couple of other things started happening, and some of the institutions in our area, the hospital in my hometown, a larger hospital, regional hospital in La Crosse, Wisconsin, wondering about how can we access local food more than we are right now. One of our producers, Organic Valley producers, also works in a local school system, and she's the person in charge of the whole cafeteria, and she starts wondering how can we access some of this local food for the schools. And you know, it really was a conundrum. There was no simple way to get it to them. So you know, these things we start looking at it, and well, how do we solve this problem? How do we, instead of, you know, sending things far away, how do we keep it right here at home? There seems to be a demand for it, and the production is there. And I'll mention one other thing that I think was kind of interesting as part of this began to develop, and that is, as part of the recession, we had a fairly significant employer pull 70 jobs out of our small town, which was a big deal, and they also left behind approximately 100,000 square foot building that suddenly had no use. And so Liz brought up Sue Noble, and I really do think it's important to give her credit, because I think a project like this always needs somebody that's a real champion, and she was an amazing champion. She's the local economic development person, and she saw what, you know, the Valley Stewardship Network had done. She was aware of what was happening with this building. And really then a core group started to come together and say, well, what do we do with this work that the Valley Stewardship Network put together? And you know, there were folks from Organic Valley that were part of that. We had, I think the woman I mentioned who is part of the school system, some of these larger institutions. And at some point the decision was, well, you know, if we were able to take a multi-stakeholder approach to this, that is the needs of the producers all the way through to these institutional buyers, and figured out a way to make this work, everybody can win. Now, Southwest Wisconsin, Minnesota, you know, these are areas where the cooperative model is known. So once they started getting their hands around this idea of, if we can have all these people at the table, we should be able to come up with a solution. Then the cooperative model was brought to the table. And you know, I think, as Liz pointed out, not so common here for this multi-stakeholder approach, but this is the route that they chose to go. And it's amazing to me the classes of membership now that this has. It has producers. So these small-scale producers I'm talking about are eligible to be members of fifth seasons. It has producer groups, such as Organic Valley or Westby Creamery, which is another co-op in the area. Processors. We have a lot of small-scale food processors that are now able to be a part of this. And again, that idea of aggregation. Distributor, that was a key piece of this, was being able to bring a distributor to the table that was willing to work with the groups to, you know, once the aggregation took place, pick it up and then help deliver it to some of these local buyers. Workers have been added, and so workers of fifth season are eligible to become members of the co-op. And then finally these buyers that I've been talking about, the hospitals, the school systems. Real quickly, you know, what are the goals then overall of fifth season? Well, really to allow this access of local products to aggregate. And I think another function that they're able to provide, particularly for some of these small-scale growers, is education around safety and food quality issues. And you know, that is something that the buyers are looking at. They're saying, we want this local food product, but we have to have some assurance that, you know, basic food safety and quality measures are being hit. And sometimes, you know, these smaller producers, again, it's a question of building capacity. Are they each going to do it on their own, or is this something then that the co-op that they're a part of can help provide for them? access to new markets for these producers, and I think a key piece of it is this idea of fair pricing all up and down it. What makes sense for the buyer? What can they do? But at the other end of the spectrum, what does the processor or the producer need? And being able to come to the table allows them to have those conversations so that, you know, really focused on a win-win situation that is solving community problems. So I think that that's a, you know, a pretty exciting part of it. I've been asked, well, you know, what has been Organic Valley's role in this? And what is it that we see that we can gain from this? Well, it actually ends up being a potential market for us as well. We're mostly known as a dairy co-op, and 90% of our revenue is in dairy. When we started, we were a co-op of produce farmers. And 25 years later, we still have those produce farmers, and it's been a long, tough road for them to be successful. This is an opportunity where we think that it's going to provide market for those folks. And then finally, you know, something that I think that Liz already brought up, and it's something that's important in Organic Valley, and it's this idea of cooperation amongst cooperatives. How can we help in our own community with this? And I'll give you one specific example of where our expertise has been able to come to the table. Several years ago, Mike mentioned it, you know, this idea of capitalization and the challenge that co-ops face with capitalization. Organic Valley went through a process where we created a preferred stock program that was very successful for us and really helped us capitalize at a time when we were growing rapidly. And I was a big part of that, and I also at that time I served on the board of the Viroqua Food Co-op, our local food co-op, and they were then looking to open a new store. Well, how were they going to raise their funds? Well, we were able to take what we learned at Organic Valley with the preferred stock program and apply it to the Viroqua Food Co-op. Worked very well for them. Well, again, now we've taken that same model with the Fifth Seasons, and they have created a preferred stock program that they've just recently taken to market to use that as an opportunity to raise funds for the overall effort. We'll see how that goes, because it's pretty. It hasn't been out there real long, and I guess I'm gonna finish up here by talking a little bit about the challenges and the lessons. And one of the things I would say is it's an unfinished story. And you know, Liz, maybe 3 years from now we get Sue to come here and be part of one of these. But having said that, you know, I think one of the things that's been very interesting is having all these people at the table, all these disparate groups at the table, some of whom are cooperators or cooperatives, and they get it. Some of whom, it's what Urban was saying, don't really have much of an idea of what a cooperative is. Gunderson Lutheran, the hospital, might be a good example of that. But we bring them along. You know, we say, well, this is the value that we can get here. I think the other thing in this case with this, it's a broad group from very small producers to, you know, like I said, a very, very successful regional hospital. Getting them, the larger players, willing to see the value of it and put some money on the table. And I think that's been a challenge. I think that definitely has been a challenge for us. I think that you know, it's not an insurmountable challenge, but again, it kind of gets back to this idea of where's the level of commitment, and you know, maybe not quite as used to the cooperative form. It's still in a startup. It's very much, I think, an experiment, but I think it's a very exciting experiment to see where it goes. And you know, I guess you know, it's very formative, but it's also very exciting to look at what it could potentially become. I think that, you know, some of the statistics we looked at, we think without a whole lot of work, there's probably a $10 million market that could be developed. Now, Fifth Seasons, I think last year, you know, their sales were less than $500,000 total. But given a little bit of time here, and really again, we think without a huge amount of development work, maybe you can scale it up to $10 million or so. So.
Terrific. I want to tell Now, I'd like to piggyback on that and say something else about Vernon County, which has become the center of the co-op universe somewhat. Because one of the lessons learned from what Jerry was talking about, how you get some of the bigger players who aren't co-op at the table. The Cooperative Development Foundation has been working in the cooperative home care work area through a grant that we have from USDA. And one of the areas that we focused on is actually Vernon County, Wisconsin. Partially, again, because Sue Noble was interested, but also the USDA field staff helped direct us there because they said there is some chemistry that has happened in that community because of the first discussions around fifth season, that whether co-ops work or not, it gets people starting to think about co-op in a different way. And it gave us a platform to go in and to begin to talk about how do you integrate a cooperative home care institution into that rural health care delivery system. And it was an area where, in the health arena, not only was Gunderson Lutheran already familiar with what a co-op was because of fifth season, but they were then now interested in how they might be able to be a player with a home care co-op that would be incubated in part through them, which for us was one of the challenges, was how do you attach or how do you integrate the home care co-op into that rural healthcare system that's already there and not have it just be an appendage out there by itself. And that the catalyst here in Vernon County was to get many of those same players around the table again to talk about the rural healthcare delivery system, some of the challenges they have, and then learn about the co-op model through the people that we brought to the table who were interested in educating them about how this is a workforce development issue. It's the aging in place. I'm sure the 30,000 in Vernon County, you have a higher than normal elderly population too, so it was a ripe area for dealing with these challenges of a rural economy and how do you deliver home care effectively in that arena. And here you had now some of these anchor institutions thinking about how do we problem solve around this. And I think even in the economy issues that were happening in Vernon County, there was also a local NGO health counseling or mental health counseling organization that closed its doors. And again, I think because of what got started through fifth season, they're now probably one of the first mental health cooperatives in the country. The former workers formed their own business, and now they have a very thriving, I think 9-person co-op there, and they're at the table too in this, so that there is that catalytic kind of opportunity that exists in the most rural places and multiply that in urban America too, and it really provides that great opportunity. I'd like to also, in that home care arena, mention that when cooperative care, which we all who are around the work of CDF at least, we know that they are the first rural home care cooperative that existed in the country. They were the product really of a county social service director who looked to New York City and Cooperative Home Care Associates and said, if they can do that in the Bronx, we should be able to do that in Waushara County, Wisconsin. A little different challenge because it's rural versus urban, but she basically had decided she had a problem. She had a caseload of Medicaid cases that she didn't want to continue to just be an intermediary in the middle of it all. And they created a co-op by having the private contractors who were their employees, their pass-through employees, become the member owners of that co-op. And the county then gave them that first tranche of business. Fast forward to this last year with the Affordable Care Act and our hope that cooperative home care can be seen as one of the reliable sources of care that's such a priority in the home and community-based care focus. It's part of the Affordable Care Act. Cooperative care went back and partnered with that same county social service department, new people now, others had retired and new players, and applied for an HHS grant in the Innovation Fund, again attached to the Affordable Care Act, which was to help the county to have a reliable source of home care to keep some of their readmission clientele out of the hospitals, which is one of the biggest things that the Affordable Care Act hopes to achieve. They didn't get the grant, but the chemistry was there from the first time. again, to where, next time they may get the grant, but where co-op is really being seen as a solution for so many problems at that level. But I think we've started something in Vernon County, you've started something in New England, and in Philadelphia, Ben Franklin started it a long time ago, so you can really fast forward to that. But I think there really is that recognition that in this sharing economy, you see it a lot with the new high-tech world too, that there's energy around sharing and innovation, and I think this is clearly the time that co-ops are in the right place at the right time, whether it's urban or rural, or if it's agriculture or worker or whatever. And with that, I'm going to turn it to our historian, our author, our workplace democracy expert to give us some thoughts on both what you've heard here, but then also from your work and from your discussions out in the economy, what you see in the cooperative economy potential in the future.
Well, first I want to say that what I'm hearing is wonderful to hear. This is really spectacular and very informative, but also, I think, symbolic of some of the things we're seeing. The first thing to say is I'm another Wisconsin guy from Racine, a lot of Wisconsin co-op people.
Yeah.
And I also used to, for the gray hairs in the audience like me, I used to run Gaylord Nelson's shop, who was a senator from Wisconsin. We got involved in economic alternatives. I was his legislative director when I began working on this way back in the late 60s and early 70s. So with that kind of, there's a lot of this feeling in the part of Wisconsin I'm from. I'm from Racine, and there's a feeling of similar vibes and themes. Just a few things that I want to say and then kind of comment on this. I've also been involved, and so it's worth mentioning, one of the other cooperative developments that's happening in Cleveland, Ohio, that our group at the university has been advising and working with. Some of you may have heard about the Evergreen Co-ops. What's interesting there, it's explicit and everything has been said here, but there it's really quite explicit. The direct use of anchor institutions, hospitals and universities primarily, but strategically, to use their procurement power and some of their capital to help worker co-ops. And there's a complex of worker co-ops developing in a very poor community, quite large scale in some cases. There is an urban greenhouse, which I think is the largest greenhouse in the country now. Produces about 3 million heads of lettuce a year is its capacity. And there's a large industrial scale laundry and a solar installation company and several others on the road, partly designed on the Mondragon model. But this linkage with the big hospitals and universities is really critical, we think, in some cases, and I've heard many people here indicating that as well, and may play a bigger role in the development of the cooperative economy. In this poor neighborhood, Case Western Reserve, the Cleveland Clinic, and University Hospital exist. They purchase $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services a year, virtually none of it from this area previously, but now some of that's being going towards these institutions, which, and it's a design feature that about 10 cities are now contemplating. The furthest along is Atlanta, which is doing something similar. So I think the point about that is that one of the things, I've been traveling around the country and also doing research on this, and it's in much more detail in the book. Most of what's going on is not reported by the press. And it's really important to know that. The press doesn't have much interest, but they really don't have any staff. Given the internet and the advertising shift that's gone away from the local newspapers, it's all but impossible to know how much is going on unless you actually go out and dig it out and research it. And there is a huge amount going on under the radar that is very, very significant. So, and a lot of that is represented by what you're talking about, because what's being said here is probably not known by large numbers of people, except within our community. Another way to say that is one of the conclusions of the research that we've done and is in this book I've written is that there is a explosion of what we're calling the democratizing economy. That includes more than co-ops, but it is any form of democratic ownership, co-ops being the leading edge, and that this is part and parcel of something broader. So for instance, community land trusts are part of that, and some CDCs, there are 5,000 community development corporations, some are part of that. There are public utilities 25% of American electricity is done by public utilities and co-ops. There are a whole range of worker-owned companies that are not co-ops. Some of the ESOPs are moving in a democratic direction. Public banking is very hot in a number of areas, like the Bank of North Dakota, which has been there for 90 years and is a public bank supporting local small business, co-ops, as well as farmers. And there is a proliferation of this kind of thing on the ground that is just beginning to catch on, and very great interest. So I just wanted to put it in that larger perspective and to say something else about it. Traveling around the country on this book tour, virtually every place I've gone on the West Coast, for instance, which I thought would be folks really intensely knew each other. I was in Portland, Seattle, and the Bay Area, just for instance. And they needed to get together. I happened to be the visiting fireman. And so they used me as a kind of prod to bring together other people who were doing these things that hadn't really gotten together yet and hadn't done the cooperative work that could be done, hadn't put together all the co-ops, and beginning to see how do we collaborate locally to build a local cooperative and democratic economy. And then looking around and seeing the resources that are available, the universities, the hospitals, some parts of the technical assistance group, some parts of the government, some local government, and beginning to try to find that. I should flag something that was really important, that virtually all of them are looking for training. How do you do it? How do you do it? How do you expand the economy? Technical assistance training programs are really important at this point because there's a great deal of interest. The other thing that I've noticed in maybe of interest to folks here, there really is a different perspective, and they really look to you. They look to the cooperative sector as the place that has been ahead of the game and could offer leadership in vision. And they don't think of it in the way that I was brought up to think about co-ops. And I'm talking about a lot of young people, some of whom came out of Occupy, some of whom are just having the same experience Urban was talking about when he was in school. They know there's a real economic crisis in this country, and a real crisis, and I would call it a systemic crisis. I don't think we're going to have kind of the easy pendulum swing kind of thing that I was brought up to experience, and some of the other folks, the older folks here, knew about pendulum swings. And partly that's because the labor movement has collapsed and doesn't give power to the old progressive forces. But what people sense is a really deep problem in the economy, and is forcing them to reassess a lot of things about where do we go, and particularly younger people. And one of the places that we might want to go to has to do with a cooperative economy of some kind. Mondragon, you mentioned. Mondragon was never anything anybody knew about except very small numbers of people had never heard of this incredible cooperative structure in the Basque Country of Spain. Now it's hot everywhere. I mean, you don't have to talk to young people at all interested. They know all about Mondragon, and they know about Emilia-Romagna, and they know about what's going on in Quebec. And so there is very intense interest, and the interest that I see, and it's very hard to grasp, is about somehow changing the system, not just building co-ops. It's an interest in, could we actually lay groundwork for something much larger? Might this go somewhere? A very tentative, kind of frightened, partly exciting vision, but looking for something different, that don't like the old way. And I think it's important to understand that level of motivation that's beginning to be grasped. And you see it in some of the international work that's being done. And it is inspiring, but it also gives people a lot of demands on what can be done. So for instance, how do you really produce what you're talking about, Bob? How can you really bring together kind of collaboration that begins to offer some concrete assistance to building out the local economy? That, what you guys are doing, is very important, and people will look to it as to how do we do it here. People are looking for other models. The same thing is happening with this Cleveland thing. 10 other cities are looking, well, maybe we could try something better. That kind of thing is on. Same with each one of the discussions here. I don't see them as isolated cases at all. I see this as historically, potentially historic work. And again, saying that, I realize it's kind of, seems odd to think of it, because the cooperative sector is a small sector relative to this gigantic economy, but the gigantic economy is in very severe trouble. and may not kind of give us the recoveries that we're looking at. So people are going local because local is where the problems are. So that seems to me a critical aspect. And the second, co-ops helping co-ops or working with multi-stakeholder aspects, groups is another piece of this puzzle. And that it also involves city government, it involves the anchor institutions, the universities, almost anybody who will play. It's catch as catch can, who wants to see what's happening locally build out. You know, I sometimes say as an economist, every airplane has to land someplace. And that means that the local economies are the keystone of whatever becomes the national economy building up. And I think that's the spirit of what you see in the development processes in each case. I've also run into, and I think this is pretty obvious to folks, there are also some problems. I mean, there are lots of problems of implementation and development, et cetera. But there is concern, so, you know, there's concern, for instance, are the credit unions going to play? Or have they been too conservative? And there's real concern that that part of the movement is not interested, and that some of the older parts of the cooperative movement doesn't take this seriously. I think that needs to be addressed. I'm not close enough to your work to know how far to go with that, but I do want to say that a lot of this young spirit, that I've heard that a lot in the research and in traveling around the country. So right or wrong, it needs to be looked at and addressed, I think, because the other thing that is important, if I look around the room, including myself and the people on this stage, we are not a young group. But there is a huge young group that is looking to this place and how to move forward and develop and find a way to go beyond what has been done by, you know, folks of our age. And so we've got to find a way to, I think, address their concerns. And the credit union thing may or may not be important. You all will know better than I how far that goes. But I did run into some activists who were electing members to boards of credit unions with the hope that they might change the direction of one particular conservative one. That may be kind of an oddball, one-off chance, but it's to know about in various parts of the country. The other very strange way of looking at this is, and this is hard to, unless you're a historian, so historians in the group, hands up, unless you see things as a historical perspective, which I tend to do, if you look at the prehistory of the New Deal, the prehistory of the New Deal was the 30 years before Roosevelt was elected, and particularly in Wisconsin, but in many states, the elements that became nationalized in the New Deal were developed at the states and localities in great pain around the country. They were developed in small places in the so-called laboratories of democracy. And when the right time came, they became, after great struggle and refinement and lots of trial and error, they became the elements that were introduced and became legislative solutions when the moment was right. And that's the other theme that I see playing out. Point one being that we are not likely, and we could have a long discussion about this, to get a resurgence of economic boom. I think stagnation is more likely than not. Most experts I know in the financial community expect more financial crises, not less. The big banks are more concentrated now than they were before the passage of Dodd-Frank. And the old political coalition that kept things in line, which was the kind of guys who elected Gaylord in the House and Senate liberals, where I come from, that coalition depended heavily on labor union support. And labor's gone from 35.4% of the membership, it's down to 11%, and only 7.6% in the private sector and declining. So that coalition is not there to kind of solve some of the big problems, which means that they are likely, in my view and in the view of many people, to develop further, and most consequentially, to put demands on local change and answers locally. So what I hear and what I see happening is people not simply building co-ops and not simply expanding and experimenting with new designs and ways to get multi-stakeholder and local coalitions and get more technical assistance, get the universities to give some courses. I see people beginning to attempt to generate answers in a failing economy that may not recover, that may stagnate and decay over a long period. And that's a whole different thing, that we haven't been facing it in those terms. So another way to say that is, The challenge that's being posed, I think, is whether or not we all see this movement, as I certainly do, as potentially a historic movement, rather than simply expanding co-ops and expanding co-op businesses. And I say that with great caution, but I think that really is the challenge that's being posed by the larger economy, and by the fact that when you look around for alternatives, this is about the only place you find people experimenting with different ways of treating economic activity, in micro or in macro or larger experimentation or in regrouping. And younger people that I've been running into and reading this book and on the lecture tour, they are looking, even the ones that are not yet involved actively in the co-op movement, they're looking for they're looking here. So I think what's exciting to hear is that each one of the experiments here, they're more than experiments, each one of the developments here tells you also, and if I would put my finger on one thing, watch the trend. In each one of these presentations, there is a developmental process. It isn't just, oh, isn't that nice, there's this thing out there. It's that something is expanding and developing and finding ways to change over time. And that's the thing of great interest to me particularly, because it suggests that there's a building opportunity and a need, but also an awareness that we can begin to develop this idea in what I sometimes call the potential prehistory of the next great shift. That is the laying down of ideas and experience and people and training and models and new ways of putting things together that I think is already going on here. Now that I'll stop here very briefly. I'm sure we'll have lots of discussion about all of this. That's a very hard way to think, for most people to think about these things. I've also experienced that going around giving lectures and people looking at me saying, what are you talking about? And what I'm saying is that most people do know, in my experience, that there's something really wrong in the country. And the poll data show it, but the economic statistics show it, and the poverty trends show it, and the ecological trends show it, and the concentration of wealth shows it. And one trend that I'll give you two numbers that keep coming up in these lectures. One trend, of course, over the last 30 years, the top 1% has taken virtually all of the economic gains of the system. It's never happened historically, maybe except at the end of the 19th century. They've gone from 10% to 22%, depending upon the year, 21%, 23%, depends upon the year, over 30 years. It's a long trend. And the top 1%, the top 400 people, and these are the things that keep coming up in the discussions, the top 400 people, now think about co-ops as transforming and democratizing ownership. The top 400 people in the United States who you could easily get in this room have more wealth today than the bottom 180 million taken together. It's a concentration of wealth that has never been experienced before. And I sometimes say to audiences, well, that's medieval. And a medieval historian came up to me afterwards and said, no, it was never that concentrated in medieval. Right. But the point of it being that the whole structure and design and the developmental process here that people are talking about is a transformative way of thinking about ownership. And it's a democratic form. And it's not like state socialism, and it's not like corporate ownership. It's a different, very American idea. And when people look for alternatives, they inevitably come back to co-ops or variations on the co-op or the Mondragon version or the different forms of it, because it is a democratic form of transforming ownership in the face of a system of extreme concentration. So I see this again, maybe as a bleary-eyed academic who used to do real politics, and Bob Kastenmeier, for some of you, obviously is LA too, for the really old folks from Madison. I've been in that hard-headed world of politics and at least have some sense of it. But as a historian, I think this is an extremely important time, and that what you're hearing here is not just, isn't it interesting what's being done in these different sectors. I think you're hearing experimentation that could be the basis, maybe because of the conditions, of far greater transformations as we go forward in this very painful period of our history. So I'm delighted to hear what's happening here, and I suspect if we went around the audience, we'd find a lot more going on that people don't publicize and that the press hasn't yet covered, but will become the expanding basis of this kind of work. So, thank you.
Thank you. open up for questions in a moment here now, so if you have a question, we have a mic at each side of the hall here, and get to a mic so that you can ask it. But first, I'd like to ask any of the panel members if you've got thoughts on Gar had an opportunity to comment on what you said. Any thoughts you have, and follow-on comments based upon the framing that he gave too.
You know, I guess I can speak from, again, my own community, and I think there's a real, I don't know, agreement with a lot of what you have to say with some of the people in the community I come from, and hence underlying some of this, you know, can do, how are we going to solve these problems, is this feeling of, and we better rely on ourselves to do it. And nobody's going to come along and save us, you know, kind of thing. And so I think that when I think about, you know, some of the things going on in this community that I call home, that is a motivation for many folks.
Well, it's not so much a question for Gar as a comment. At my co-op in Philadelphia, Weaver's Way Food Co-op, Retail Consumer Co-op, we had Gar come to our general membership meeting in maybe 2006, and at that time he had published another book, and so that had gotten mentioned. And after the meeting, which was great, and he challenged us and he inspired us, we put out a sign-up sheet for a book club to read his book together. And we had tremendous enthusiastic response to that, and we had like we had a Wednesday night group and a Thursday night group and a Monday. There were so many people who wanted to read that book together and discuss it. So I'm sitting here thinking, and I just, you know, so I got the idea through PACA, you know, we have our newsletter goes out to whatever, 300-400 people. You know, we could put out a call to start this book club that with the new book that's just come out. I haven't read it yet, so I'd love to read it with other people and discuss it. So there's an idea for us and anybody else who might want to do that.
Did you arrange this?
Yeah.
Urban, any?
Yeah, like Gar, I've been sort of wrestling with this question of whether this economy represents an opportunity for co-ops or an obligation. And I tend to fall on the obligation side. As a movement, I feel like if this isn't the moment for us to share, you know, what we can do differently, then I don't know what is. And if we approach it just from the opportunity side, I think we're thinking too much about, hey, this is a way we can grow our individual businesses. You know, the great thing about teaching this course at UMass was just the forthright, here's what you're doing wrong, I got from our students. You know, here's all the things you could be doing better, here's what I don't understand, here's what's wrong with the movement. It was just really exciting to see people grab a hold of it as their own and critique it, not just say, hey, this is great, this is going to solve all of our problems, but say, here's what you can do better. So I think there is an obligation for us to be out there and offer a vision that offers some hope. I mean, as bad as the economy is, I feel like people have already forgotten what has happened. I mean, it's just an incredible amount of wealth that's been lost and redistributed, as you pointed out, in a totally different way.
The thing that strikes me is what you just said about obligation or opportunity. That's another thing I keep hearing around. You know, it's a really wonderful thing to do a book because you learn more than you teach by far. And that sense of obligation, that it's very, not just how do we, people are, the ones I talk to are pretty hip about business strategy. They're not playing around. They want to be sure their business is, their cooperative business is solid. But it's not about that in lots of places. It's about how do we change the culture? How do we build something different? It's a very different feeling, and lots of, you know, there are a lot of people who don't have that quality. But I pick up a lot of that in younger people, really hungry for what you're talking about, and pretty hard-headed. There's something out in Seattle called the Bainbridge Graduate School of Business, I think it's called. Somebody may know exactly the title. But basically, it's a business school set up to kind of business school, not just theoretical. how do you do this stuff, and very oriented to co-op development and land trusts and public utilities and anything that democratizes it. Democratic ownership is the name of the game. But asking tough questions at the same time. The vision is quite very serious historic. Change the system somehow, and we're starting here. What's happening here? Nobody's going to do it for us. Is the other piece. In the pain levels, you know, young people with these debt levels, they know something's really wrong.
I have a question with the book tour. You talk about the younger generation. To what extent is an older generation also engaged in this? Because my guess is it isn't just the youth, but that it's probably there's a heavy dosage in the youth.
That's another finding. Again, when you go into a bookstore and talk about your book, it's just kind of a weird feeling anyway. Hearing is that, you know, 60s, people from the 60s who are in their 60s wanting to do things. 60s in the, I think it'd be a great name for an organization, 60s in the 60s. but there's a lot of folks who were motivated in the 60s who are retiring or not, got a lot of skills, maybe have a little economic security. They show up at some of these talks. It's quite interesting to see that. It's a totally different group. There's a gap between the new generation and these gray hairs like me. But that's part of the game. The other thing that we've happened in Cleveland, and I'm sure you've seen this everywhere, in these Cleveland efforts, which is trying to do these large-scale worker co-ops linked together on the Mondragon model, older business people who are retired, willing to help and throw in their skills, so you can draw on their talent and skills, which is very important because they may not always quite understand the cooperative model, but they know something about business that needs to be known.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add on that, or piggyback on it a little bit. I think one of the interesting things that's been happening in our region is you know, you're finding allies or partners in places you might not have assumed. You know, and there is there's sort of an assumption that the goal of a sole proprietor is to sell out for as much as they can get when they're done running the business. Right. And in our region, we've recently had a lot of conversions of existing businesses. You know, in our food co-ops, we had one co-op buy a local store so it wouldn't leave that town. We had a grocery store convert to a co-op. And just in the past, I think 2 years, we've had 3, maybe 5 sole proprietors convert to worker co-ops.
That's it.
And it's all been, the way that started to happen, we've sort of opened a mini floodgate, is offering a path for sole proprietors who are uncomfortable with the idea of selling off what to them is already a community asset to the market, and offering them a different path that keeps that infrastructure rooted in the community. And I don't think anybody would have assumed that would be a natural relationship.
That's very, I mean, there's always been the co-op opportunity with the ESOP, but this is what you're just saying, just straight ahead, sell off to a co-op. Very interesting. I hadn't heard about that, actually.
Rebecca, first question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Rebecca Kemble. I'm a member of Union Cab Worker Co-op in Madison, president of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, and I sit on the executive committee of SECOPA also. So an idea I've been tossing around in my mind privately that I want to put to Jerry and URBIN very publicly today is a Dairyland alliance between Vermont and Wisconsin, starting with the co-ops. So that's just silly, came to my mind. But I couldn't agree with you more, Gar, about the need to get beyond building co-ops as discrete businesses. Really, the heart and soul of a co-op is the cooperation with others, and it's critical. What I heard a lot of is that we're building the connective tissue not only among individual businesses but between sectors, and that's what the Federation has been working on with our Democracy at Work network and our Democracy at Work Institute that provides that technical assistance based on not theories, academic theories, but actual practitioners being trained to be trainers and going out and actually doing it. And that I really appreciated, URBIN, you talking about the importance of the accountability to members in all ways. And I would push your point a little bit further, Gar, of saying we need to go beyond building businesses to democratizing ownership, to even moving even beyond that and saying, I mean, if this financial system is really as unstable as many people think it is, we need to think beyond ownership and go back to our co-op roots of what do co-ops do? They address needs. We don't have a need of ownership, but we do have a need of clean water. We do have a need of community. We do have a need of food and shelter and working together. And to really even use the historic tools that we have and the practice that we've built up in our institutions in this country to really to look more deeply at that and to think more creatively about how do we meet our needs, not just how do we all profit from our association with each other financially. And there's a story last week out of Wisconsin that was very, very disturbing to me at one of our big ag co-ops. They're expanding production, but they just fired 100 workers. And so in the state where, you know, we have a rich, long co-op tradition, this is how some of our co-op enterprises are behaving. And we really need to challenge each other within the movement to be true to really to our principles and stay true to meeting our members' needs. Thanks.
I certainly agree with the argument that you've just made. Just to put it in another way, it's not only the cooperative vision. You're, I think, talking about changing the system in terms of the system. And that's what the theme that I keep hearing. It isn't just about co-ops. It's about something's wrong with the system. Now, how far we can go with that in a very difficult time and a very powerful system, that's to be seen. But that's what she's just said is what I keep hearing. People thinking about, and younger people thinking about, where's this going over the next 30 years? Where am I going to go? What's happening? And it is a very different vision. I mean, I try to capture some of that in the book, but I think that's a challenge to the people who've been doing it for a long time in a different era. That there's a different way of think of building on the wonderful experience that's been developed.
Can I go back to, I know from the Healthy Food Initiative, Urban, that you've been working on, there are social service agencies as partners in that particular. Were you involved in cultivating those partnerships? Can you give some sense of kind of who are some of the natural partners that you've, outside the cooperative community, not just the obvious ones that are the co-ops?
Sure. They tend to be, you know, advocacy organizations for low-income communities or immigrant communities. There's a group called Hunger Free Vermont that we've been in dialogue with. And I think the reason that those relationships are important is because we're not just talking about making sure that food is more affordable. We're also talking about trying to make ownership more accessible. And in order to do that, you need to talk to people where they are. And you know, I don't think we should ever assume our food co-ops are perfect in how we communicate with low-income communities or immigrant communities, and it's great to have partners that can help in that dialogue. And so that's sort of the approach we've been trying to take with it, recognizing that, you know, we do speak different languages about different things in different ways, and how do you maximize understanding there. While I was talking, I did want to mention on the first point, one of the interesting things we've been doing in sort of cross-sector understanding is you know, Organic Valley's been a big partner of ours, and we did some tours of some local Organic Valley member farms with our dairy buyers. And it was, you know, it's hard to remember these things when you've been embedded in the co-op movement as long as I have, but I had, you know, people saying very often, you know, I thought all the milk came from Wisconsin, right? They had no idea there's 250 OV dairy farms in their backyard, like almost literally. And just that one experience of meeting those producers and beginning to understand the model from another perspective, I think opened a lot of minds to cross-sector collaboration.
You know, just to further what Urban's saying, I go to the CCMA conference just about every year, and it's a conference designed for the retail food co-ops. And I can't tell you how many times I've had the exact conversation Urban just brought up, be it somebody from Vermont, California, and you know, the fact of the matter is, at this point, we do have farmers throughout the country, and we've really tried to use our co-op model as a means of, again, this word aggregation, but within that, how can we then leverage that into regional distribution on a large scale so that the production from our dairy farmers in Vermont is staying in the Northeast, you know, and things of that. And of course, something like that just makes plain good business sense, right? You know, so, but it is interesting to think about, just even within the co-op world, even within the food co-op world, you know, we're not doing a good enough job of telling our story so that those folks understand what Urban said, that in many cases, our members, our producers, are in their backyards and are their neighbors.
Yeah. Howard.
Liz, yes. Howard Brodsky from CCA Global Partners. Gar, this is a question to you. You had talked about that the press, co-ops don't really get a lot of press, and they don't. And my sense is from talking with a lot of people that I know, intelligent business people, when I first tell them I'm in the co-op world, and they sort of have a blank stare. And we're a fairly good-sized company, and it's a blank stare, like, well, tell me, I don't understand what you do. And yet, not only these stories, but everybody I know, when you actually tell people what you do, then they go, and they love it. And I was in a panel at Harvard Business School, and there was 2 other very large companies with me. And when it came to the Q&A, all they wanted to know was what we did. And they were fascinated by it. All the people come up afterwards. And my question is this: do you think when people think of co-ops, they think of an old model, not of a new model? And do you think it needs almost rebranding in some fashion? You know, when you talk about democratizing ownership, people think of it differently. And in our world, look at the people here think of co-ops as this, which it is, this wonderful, innovative, great movement of going on, but the outside world does not look at that. Even, as I said, intelligent, progressive business people don't look at that because they don't understand it. And how do you feel, how can you reach the message, and is it a branding message or a press message? Where do you think the issue is?
I certainly don't know that in any sense. I do think that one of it is just lack of knowledge or information, and in the sense of the press doesn't report on any of this. It just doesn't. And so people don't know, unless you're from Wisconsin, where we are, or Vermont, or certainly Madison. I don't know what the branding issues are. I mean, I think that the idea of co-ops, when you explain it, is very important. People understand it. That changing ownership, democratizing the ownership of wealth in some way, people get that somehow. They think there should be more democratic, but very vague. I think the other thing is scale. I think people mainly think of co-ops either as something farmers do, and they certainly don't think of credit unions really as co-ops, though that's the biggest sector by far. So it doesn't appear that way. And I think they think of co-ops as little things. And why scale that's why Mondragon is very important, because all of a sudden it's opened up scale. And what you guys are doing, you mean it's, the credit unions taken together are bigger than, I think, all but 3 of the big 5 banks in New York. It's a big deal. So I think there is probably, maybe, this is just a guess, over time as people become aware that something's going on here, that there's 130 million people involved in credit unions and co-ops. 40% of the population is involved in credit unions and co-ops and are members, mostly credit unions, but still. That over time that we'll begin to see more awareness. Also, isthmus engineering is really important in this, because it's a model of something very high-tech, very sophisticated. And when they hear about that, it also opens a different door. I just think we've got to keep telling the story and expanding it and doing more and better of the kind of things we're hearing in the panel today.
John?
Yeah, thank you all for your great stories, very inspiring. My name is John Whitman. I teach at Georgetown and American. So Jerry, I have a question for you. And maybe this is a little nuts and bolts, but maybe we can learn something about it. In terms of your multi-stake approach to creating a local market for produce, I'm curious as to how ultimately the people around the table did reach agreement on a fair price. It seems pricing would be a real problem, especially when your competition is Cisco or Walmart.
Sure. I'm not certain I can give you the nuts and bolts level answer because I've not been a part of those kinds of conversations. What I would say and suspect is, again, that part of what Organic Valley has been able to bring to the table, perhaps, is experience with communicating around that kind of an issue. And so what I mean is we've built our model. It's all about a stable and a sustainable price for the producers. And we've gotten very good at telling that story. And we've actually, I think, gotten very good at using that as a means to educate buyers, educate consumers about why we might be a good choice. And, you know, we say we start here with what we've got to pay our farmers, and then, you know, there's a small amount of marketing on there, and there's the freight, and then we need a small profit, and voila, here's our price. And how can you argue with that? Because if you're arguing with it, what you're saying is you're taking money out of the farmers' pockets, basically. So I suspect that some of that and our experience with that was helpful to, you know, how do you, like you said, work through this each place in the food chain, and I think at some it's about compromise and sacrifice as well. That those large institutional buyers had to be given the insight that this is not going to meet Cisco's prices probably, but you're saying you want something that has value, which is that this is locally produced food. So are you willing to pay something of a premium for that? And oh, by the way, producers, you know, you're small scale. You're having right now to market all your products somehow in markets that, you know, are Chicago or Minneapolis, as I was saying. There's a cost to that. We can take that cost out of the system for you, perhaps. So, you know, again, it's looking at it from each of those angles, and there has to be, for this to work, a spirit of compromise and cooperation.
Bob?
Just a follow-up on the model that Fifth Season's developing. I was curious if you mentioned on the consumer member class, the institutions or the large consumers. Has there been any talk of retailers being?
I failed to mention Vertical Food Co-op in relation to this. They were key players throughout this, and the general manager there was part of the original steering group, and so yes, and I know Michelle Schrey's in the audience, and she manages People's Food Co-op in La Crosse, and I don't know if you've had an involvement, but I think that yes, there has been outreach too. It's not just the institutional buyers, but the retailers as well.
Vernon?
The first question I had was pretty much answered, asked just the last one, but I'm going to ask it a little bit different, Jerry. When you look at the whole process from producer to user and distributor, do you have any sense of whether or not the cost will be less overall? And if it was $100 without the system, would it be 80? I assume the quality is going to be there, and you mentioned that?
Sure.
Okay, so you get value and at less price, or is it going to be value at more price?
I think that's a great question, and I don't have the answer to that, but I think as this matures, that's got to be one of the central things, because they have to, they have to bring value, and whether it ends up being on the whole cheaper or somewhat more expensive, I'm not sure. What I would say is it has to at least be in the ballpark, but that's one of those questions for 3 years from now when we invite Sue Noble back.
All right, I'll see you 3 years from now. The next question is for Garv. By the way, my name is Vernon Oakes. I'm here with the National Association of Housing Co-ops. Education seems to be the big issue, and getting training one of the principles. Have you ever thought about creating a university that's owned by the workers, and whose main objective is to teach I like your democratic businesses just opposed to cooperative businesses? Or what do you think about that idea and maybe getting it started?
I certainly have thought about something like that, and I think that I like that idea, and I would hope that somebody would do that, and I would be happy to participate. I'd be happy to follow you.
You know, I've been looking to where I can get a PhD in cooperatives, and then I've called around and Googled it, and it doesn't seem to be a place. And
well, some of the business schools are beginning to teach social enterprise, and they're making courses available. And I've been waiting for one to set up a co-op training program out of a business school. I haven't yet seen one. Maybe somebody's heard. There may be some that have done it, other than this Bainbridge graduate school, which is, you know, a small attempt to do something. But maybe somebody knows about that's happened already.
I do know that Drexel University has in the business school a co-op, a basic introductory course on co-op that everybody in the business school is to take. So that there is a base there of an understanding that is building some knowledge level that's unique in a business school of environment.
Yeah.
Urban.
I should just mention also the St. Mary's program that I mentioned is overseen by the Cooperative Management Education Co-op, and the board is those member co-ops, faculty, and alums. The Mondragon University is also multi-stakeholder co-op.
Right. Yeah, Mondragon started with that concept. I mean, started with a training program. Built out from there.
I have a question related to education of membership is one of the 7 co-op principles too. To what extent you who are part of co-ops, is education of just your members, or have you been venturing out into that broader education as we're talking about that outreach? Are you able to bring something to the table by virtue of the investment you have in education? Does that translate into something with the other stakeholders in the community?
Well, in Philadelphia, that's one of our 4 areas of focus. So we are developing a presentation, a co-ops 101 type of course that we hope to use with members, with staff of co-ops and credit unions, with the general public, and within that, particularly we want to take it out to the community and economic development group of people, the local CDCs. There's a group in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Association of Community Development Corporations, and there's another large group called the Urban Affairs Council that has communities. So there's a lot of nonprofits and public people devoted to economic development that don't know a lot about co-ops. So they're definitely a target. We want them to have co-ops as a tool and be building toward co-ops, and then of course policymakers also. So when you talk about co-op education, there's a lot of audience different.
Mm-hmm. I can mention one example. It's certainly been something that our members have been really interested in. We've been trying to figure out how to take curriculum into something that they could use, but the core of our partnership with the the New England Farmers Union, which is the regional chapter of the national, is really around policy and trying to figure out how we can use our 80,000 consumer members to advocate for better food policy. But one of the things that the national does is a lot of curriculum development, and last year they did a curriculum on co-ops for the year of co-ops, and it includes modules from preschool to adult. And basically they gave that to us to adapt to our region. So we took what was largely an ag-based curriculum and wove in food co-ops and worker co-ops and credit unions and used examples from our region. And that's actually available on the New England Farmers Union website for free download. So we've been trying to do that sort of mass education opportunity as well.
Jerry, I know it may be heresy, speaking of Cabot, in the midst of Organic Valley too, but I know they developed a badge for Girl Scouts. as another community engagement activity. And I actually shared that with some folks that own Ace Hardware stores in the area, and they've decided it was perfect for having their own employees learn more about what a co-op was. So there are a lot of opportunities, I think, to draw on work that's already there. Emily, do we have another question?
Taking my last question in, to the whole panel. I was at Howard University a year and a half ago when Urban League was talking about the State of the Union. So I got up to ask a question about co-ops, and there was 1,500 people in the audience. There was total quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. I don't think anybody knew what I was talking about was the reason. I didn't think it was because I looked like I was from Mars or something. But when you look at the Weavers, the Rochdale Principles, 1844, they were basically poor people. And so I was trying to get to, at the Howard Universities, how do we get minorities involved, more minorities, more, I'm from West Virginia, Appalachia, poor people involved in how you create your own business and take care of your own life. And anybody have any sense of that, maybe using the Chicago model with our Cleveland model of perhaps that might be a way of doing it, which I found exciting here today, but anybody have any ideas about that?
I think there are a few examples of food co-ops coming into existence, and if I recall, maybe not even a store, but a basically delivery system in urban areas where, so the so-called food desert, right, where the options for the folks living there are, the corner convenience store, the liquor store to buy food. There's not a grocery store within a reasonable distance. And, so I think there are a few cases where that kind of activity has been going on. And I think that, I would just go back to something that we've been talking about, which is this idea of education. And what is it that co-ops offer? Well, they offer solutions to problems. All right, and so being able to, in a meaningful way, articulate this could be a solution to X problem for a group of impoverished folks, whether it's in the inner city or in more rural settings. The key is how do you make those connections and get that message across.
So let me just say a couple of things about this. The Evergreen model. This one's with the cooperatives and the anchor institutions, is in a almost entirely African-American neighborhood of Cleveland, with average family incomes $18,000 and unemployment probably 30%. And so it's the economic development, and many of the anchor institutions that are happening, I think the same thing is true in the Atlanta one, that are in very, very poor communities, and mostly black. So that's one piece. The other part was I spent some time in going from Tennessee to North Carolina and back, and including the Highlander School, which some of you may remember, the great civil rights training school up in the mountains there. And there is a lot of small interest co-ops, small-scale co-ops, agricultural, sewing, et cetera, and trying to see whether there's a way to build out in rural areas that I was not aware of until I was taken around that area on this book tour. So that's something simply just to know about. I also should mention, quite related, not related or related, Yes Magazine has a wonderful issue on co-ops, which is they're using as a training, all kinds of information on co-ops, which is very, and it's getting a lot of circulation. You have it
we
here.
have copies over on the table for
it's
everyone.
really good, and it's comprehensive of what's, and it tells you, because Yes is not particularly addressed to this audience. It's addressed to a much broader audience that really wants to learn about co-ops, and there's a market for that. Again, there it is. Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Emily.
Yeah, hello, I'm Emily Lippold-Cheney. My favorite affiliation at the moment is my engagement in the development of the USA Cooperative Youth Council, which is exciting. Yesterday in our Cooperation Works meeting, or the day before, we had a conversation with the same framing as this panel in terms of what is participation and what does that mean for us. And one of the things that came out of that conversation is, how do we talk about participation? What is the language that we use to talk about what this means to our members and also to those in the general public? And what does this mean to, how do we explain participation in a way that says, that explains that it's meaningful and that it's what differentiates us from other enterprises, and it's also what makes us a part of something bigger. And I think this also speaks to kind of this branding and messaging and language conversation that's been coming up a few times today during our conversation. And I heard Bob refer to the cooperative, our cooperative movement. And I hear Dr. Michael Cook talk about economic participation being solidarity. And these concepts of movement building as participation being movement building, and talking about our cooperative community as a movement and about solidarity. Now, those are all very friendly words to me. I really like that framing. But I appreciate that that's not this, not everyone feels that way. In fact, I do receive a lot of pushback from my colleagues as to using that kind of language. But I'm curious as to what you think about that. And I'm also curious as to what other words and concepts you think are useful if those, in fact, are not palatable for everyone or the general public. So we can talk about what it is that sets us apart from everyone else.
I'm smiling. That's why I'm going to, just neglect what I'm about to say. I love this because the first one's about participation. During the 1968 uprisings in France, there was a sign on the wall, one of these wall signs. How do you conjugate the term participate? I participate, you participate, we participate, they decide. So we want a decision. So the other nasty thing I have to say is, there have been 3 polls lately, national polls by well-respected national, Rasmussen is the most recent, and Gallup is part of this. People under 30 have slightly more positive reaction to the word socialism than capitalism, which blew me away. Certainly in my era, that would have been impossible to imagine. So I don't know what the branding is, but as Bob Dylan used, at times they seem to be changing in some way that may open up real discussion of who makes the decisions and,
Anybody else?
In my co-op, participation has been a real hot button, controversial. It's stirred things up like, boycotts used to years ago, and we'd have the biggest membership meetings. And when we opened up our second store, there was a proposal put forward to change our model in 2 respects. One, because historically, from the early 70s, this is our 40th anniversary at Weaver's Way, and we were always only members could shop, and to be a member you had to work in the store, and that kind of participation, you had to work there. And then when we opened up our second store, there was a proposal to change both of those, and it was just a tremendously big argument, which was eventually resolved on by looking at there's different levels and different ways of participating, and there's economic participation, and then there's I learned from Marilyn Scholl about the pyramid of different levels of participation. But the concept in general, it seems to me to be really at the heart of cooperation. It's hard to imagine cooperating without participating. And I've always wondered, I don't know the answer, but I asked the question, why is participation not one of the cooperative principles? It sort of seems to be in there, and maybe someday it will be, or maybe not. Maybe it's appropriate that there's not, but I appreciate the question. I think it's a good one.
What did the co-op decide?
What?
What did the co-op decide?
We decided to change the model. We thought the financial success of that second store, and it was a trade-off because in a way, we were accused of diluting what membership meant in the co-op, and I think to an extent that's true. If you're not working in the store, it doesn't have quite as much meaning. But what we gained was exposing a much broader a number of people to the cooperative business model, and we were able to expand our membership. So we gained that at the expense of and we have an optional work program still, so we still encourage participation, but it's no longer required.
We're almost out of time, but we have 2 more questions, so if we can take those, I'd love to be able to get them in.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Hanlon, and I serve on the board of the Cooperative Fund of New England, as well as being a worker owner to 2 worker co-ops that are involved in the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops of Western Mass. My experience with cooperation came in a different way, working at one of the student-run businesses at UMass Amherst. And I learned about co-ops in a very learn-by-doing type of way. At the time when I was at UMass, there was no formal curriculum, there were no classes. I couldn't talk to really any professor about co-ops and how to go further with it. So I'm just wondering, any of you that are connected to universities currently or going to universities to speak, if you're talking about education in a different way, or if you're incorporating into your classes internships or something like that. I'm familiar with some of the work that's going on at UMass right now, but I'm wondering how we can work together to teach cooperators before they're in a co-op. I think a lot of the training happens when you're already there, when you're already working, but how do we bring it back to students that just have to learn about cooperation and run a business at the same time?
Gar, you may be the only one who's right in the...
I'm at the university. At the moment, I'm what's called a research professor, which means I'm writing at the moment. There have not been any internships available for co-ops that I'm aware of. University of Maryland is way backward on many of these things. It's very hard to actually get innovations going. But some people in the business school are beginning to experiment with social enterprise and internships. And that's where we've been pushing to see whether or not we could open up a cooperative internships on that side. It's not that easy. On the other hand, selected places around the country, I should mention this because I've said all this about capitalism in crisis and people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's really been interesting to me is that some of the business leaders are much more aware of that than most people are aware. I suggest you go to a website called the Academy of Management. They meet once a year, 10,000 business school professors who are mainly consultants to business. They all, right at the heart of corporate America. Read the discussion of what they're doing this year for their annual meeting and the only papers they will accept from the Academy. It reads like Karl Marx. Capitalism is in crisis. Is there any way out of this? What's happening? What about alternatives? I read it's very gray flannel suit, but the questions that they are posing are very, very radical questions because something's really wrong. So if you want to see the other side of this, it's a wake-up call to see what they're doing. And they're inviting people like me to talk to them about this stuff, which is, again, looking at what's going over the fence out there. But I'm saying that there's an awareness that there's a real problem, and looking for alternatives from their side, we need to catch up with them in a way.
I would just offer that NCBA had an intern this year for 6 months from Drexel again, and it was a work-study opportunity where the student was able to pick whatever topic they wanted to study, and they wanted to learn about co-ops. So there are those opportunities. They're not out there as much as they should be, but there's some good models. Can we get our last question? Bob, you were going to come.
Well, I just heard just last week the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops is coordinating intern availability and there's some new program that's going on in terms of coordinating internships, and I don't know which colleges or universities are being involved in this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Brian?
I'll make a comment. I'm Brian Heenahan, and that's a kind of a good segue to my comment. I've just wrapped up a career at Cornell University, almost 30 years as director of the Cooperative Enterprise Program. We taught an undergraduate course on cooperatives. Hundreds of students took it, have had PhD students study focused on cooperatives with Bruce Anderson. Chris Peterson at Michigan State, some of you may know Chris, got his PhD at Cornell. I belong to the National Society of Accountants of Cooperatives. I've served as secretary of a Northeast Council of Cooperatives. I belong to an academic group of researchers that focuses on cooperatives. My point is, there really are a lot of resources. Maybe we aren't good at advertising and getting them out there, but don't dismiss the organizations that exist. Many of them are built around agriculture, but I think the basic concepts can be adapted to all kinds of different cooperatives. And the last point is there are cooperative development credit unions. One in Ithaca. Ithaca is a little like Madison, I guess, but alternatives credit unions. So there's a network of cooperative educators, researchers, professionals, consulting firms. So don't reinvent the wheel is one suggestion. And two, I don't mean to preach here, but being an educator in academia, you know, collaboration across sectors really is very important. That's my final comment, and commend you for tackling that. Wisconsin's probably done more of that than other parts of the country, and I see our moderators at the podium, and we've got to close this down, but thank you, and appreciate all of your discussion.
Thank you.
You're right. He's back, as I pledged. I may not be the smartest light bulb in the box, but I've learned one thing over the years, and that is thirst is directly proportional to fanny fatigue. And I can see it on your faces. Before we formally close, I want to make just a couple of quick comments. Number one, don't forget about Gar's book signing. He will be at the cocktail celebration next door. Make sure you stop by and get a copy of his latest book, Straight Talk About the Next American Revolution. Speaking of Gar, again, far be it from me to take issue with an accomplished academician. He looks out and sees nothing but elders. I look out and see nothing but teenagers. You have to be impressed. Many of us can sit around the table all day long, all week long, all year long. We can theorize, we can philosophize, we can strategize, we can talk all these wonderful plans, schemes, and dreams, but you have been blessed this afternoon with three men who have done it. And you should be in their debt for the 2.5 hours that they've shared with you, and offer them a round of applause for their contribution. Don't forget the Cooperative Hall of Fame induction ceremony and dinner is this evening in this room at 7 o'clock for those of you who will be participating as well. Thank you all for your attention, your attendance, for all of you on the panel. Let's do this again next year. Thank you.